Well, hello there. I am Gemini.
Hey there and welcome. Have you ever picked up a product off a shelf and really thought about its true cost? I'm not talking about the price tag you see. I mean, what's the actual value that a company puts on its balance sheet? Well, today we're going to pull back the curtain on that. We're diving into the International Accounting Standard IAS 2 to figure out exactly what costs get included in the value of inventory and, just as importantly, what costs get kicked out. So, here's our roadmap. First, we'll start with the big picture, the basic definition of inventory cost. Then, we'll get into the nitty-gritty, breaking down purchase costs, manufacturing costs, and some of those trickier gray area expenses. And to wrap it all up, we'll cover the stuff you absolutely can't include and a couple of special rules you've got to know.
All right, let's jump right in. Before we get into all the details, we really need to nail down the core principle. The fundamental idea behind how inventory is measured, according to IAS 2. Here it is, the official definition. It basically boils everything down into three main buckets. What you paid to purchase it, what it costs to convert it, to actually make it, and any other costs you had to spend to get it to where it is right now, in its current state. The key thing to remember here is this isn't just about crunching numbers. It's about accurately capturing all the economic resources a company has tied up in the stuff it plans to sell. We're going to unpack each one of these.
Let's start with the one that seems the most straightforward, the cost of just buying goods from a supplier. But as you're about to see, it's not quite as simple as just looking at the sticker price.
Of course, the purchase price is your starting point. But then you've got to add in all the necessary costs to get those goods, like import duties or shipping fees. The whole idea is to capture every single cost that was unavoidable. But then, and this is key, you have to turn around and subtract things like trade discounts or rebates. Why? Because those reduce the actual cash you spent. What you're left with is the true net cost of getting that inventory in the door. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, especially with rebates. How you account for them completely changes based on one simple question. Is that rebate written down in a contract? If the answer is yes, and you're pretty sure you're going to hit the target to get it, you can go ahead and reduce your inventory cost right away. But if that rebate is discretionary, meaning your supplier might give it to you but they don't have to, then you have to wait, even if you are 99% certain it's coming. This is all about being prudent. You only account for what's basically guaranteed. Let's look at a real example. So in this scenario, there's a clear volume target in the contract. And since the company is confident they're going to hit that target, they can accrue that $45,000 rebate right now. Just look at the bottom line. This directly drops the cost of their inventory on the balance sheet from $900,000 all the way down to $855,000. Pretty significant.
Okay, now let's flip the coin. In this case, the supplier gives out rebates all the time, but it's not written down anywhere. So even though the company feels like a rebate is probably coming, look at the outcome. They're not allowed to accrue anything. The inventory cost stays at the full $840,000. The best they can do is maybe mention it as a contingent asset in the notes. The difference between these two scenarios is huge, and it really shows you how much contracts matter in accounting.
All right, so we've talked about buying goods. Now let's shift gears and talk about making them. This brings us to conversion costs, which is just a fancy way of saying all the expenses from the factory floor that turn raw materials into finished products. Generally, we split conversion costs into three main groups. You've got your direct costs. That's the easy stuff, like the wood to make a chair. Then you have all the indirect factory costs, which we call production overheads, and those get broken down even further into two types, variable and fixed. The difference between these two overheads is really important. Variable overheads, like the electricity that run the machines, go up as you produce more. They get allocated based on how much you actually produced. Fixed overheads, like the factory's rent, stay the same no matter what, and those get allocated based on the factory's normal capacity. Now that term, normal capacity, is super important, and it has some big consequences, as we're about to see. So here's a fundamental rule of IAS 2. You cannot capitalize your own mistakes. If there's a crazy amount of wasted material or a big production screw-up, you can't just hide those costs inside your inventory value. Nope. They have to be expensed right away, hitting your income statement. And why is that? It's to make sure the financial statements show the true, efficient cost of making something, which is exactly the kind of info an investor needs to see. And that same logic applies to your fixed costs, which is where normal capacity comes into play. Imagine your factory rent is $10,000 a month, and you normally make 1,000 units. Simple math, right? That's $10 of rent per unit. But what if one month you have a slowdown and only make 500 units? Well, you can't just load $20 of rent onto each unit to make the math work. The rule says you still only allocate $10 to each of those 500 units, and the other $5,000 of unallocated rent, that gets expensed immediately. This stops companies from making their inventory look more valuable just because they had a slow month. Okay, on to our third and final category of costs that can go into inventory. These are the other costs. And the rule is you can only include them if they were absolutely necessary to get the inventory to its current location and in its current condition. And yeah, this is where things can sometimes get a little gray.
Transportation is a perfect example of a gray area, but this makes it super clear. Let's follow the journey. Step 1, the cost to ship raw materials to your factory, that's in. Step 2, the cost to move your finished goods from the factory floor to your own warehouse, that's in too. But look at step 3, the cost to deliver that product from your warehouse to the customer, that's out. That's considered a selling cost. The line is drawn once the product is ready and waiting to be sold.
So what about costs that happen outside the factory? Let's say the cost to design a custom product for one specific client. Well, IAS 2 actually allows you to include that because it's a cost directly tied to getting that specific inventory ready. The catch, though, is that the company needs to have a clear, rational, and consistent policy for it. You can't just decide on the fly what to include one year and what to exclude the next. That would make the numbers totally unreliable.
So, we've waded through the gray areas of what you might be able to include. Now let's make things crystal clear. Let's look at the costs that IAS 2 says you can never, under any circumstances, include in the cost of your inventory.
Think of this as your essential do not capitalize list. We've already hit on abnormal waste and selling costs. But this list also makes it clear that most storage costs are out. And so are general administrative overheads. Things like the salaries for the folks in the head office. Those costs don't directly help produce anything, so they're always treated as an expense for the period.
But in accounting, there's almost always an exception, right? And the one for storage costs is pretty cool. Normally, the cost to store finished goods in a warehouse is an expense. But what about products like fine wine, or aged whiskey, or certain cheeses? For those products, storage isn't just about waiting for a buyer. It's a critical part of the production process itself. The aging makes the product what it is. In those special cases, the storage costs absolutely can and should be included in the inventory's value.
Okay, let's wrap this up with two final but really important rules. These deal with exactly when inventory should first appear on your books and how you handle some unusual ways of paying for it.
So imagine you buy some inventory, but you get really long payment terms, like 2 years to pay, instead of the usual 30 days. Well, you've basically gotten a loan along with your goods. IAS 2 says you have to split that. The inventory gets recorded at what it would have cost if you paid cash today. Any extra amount you pay over those 2 years, that gets treated as interest expense. It's a smart rule that stops companies from beefing up their asset values with financing costs.
And finally, when does that inventory officially become yours and show up on your balance sheet? The rule is simple. It's the moment you gain control over it. Control means you can direct its use and get the benefits from it. This is usually defined by the shipping terms. Like the example here, with FOB shipping point, control transfers the second those goods are loaded onto the ship. At that exact moment, it's your inventory, even if it's still floating in the middle of the ocean.
And that really brings us to our final thought for the day. We've seen words like probable, normal capacity, and rational policy used all over the place. And while IAS 2 gives us a fantastic framework, applying it in the real world takes a ton of professional judgment and estimation. So while we're always aiming for precision, calculating the true cost of inventory is a pretty complex mix of art and science. Which leaves us with this question. With so many judgments involved, can it ever really be a perfect science?